My name is Anna, and for most of my life, I learned how to smile while being quietly measured against a standard I was never meant to beat. I learned how to swallow anger until it burned like acid in my chest. I learned how to be the good one in a family that never planned to reward goodness. And for years, I told myself that if I just worked harder, stayed quieter, and asked for less, eventually the scales would balance themselves. They didn't. They never do when the game is rigged from the start. Growing up, my parents never said my brother was better than me. They didn't need to. The message was baked into every conversation, every decision, every careful silence. When my brother took the SAT, they refused to tell me his score because they didn't want to hurt my feelings. Not because he had done poorly, but because they assumed I would never do better. They decided that for me before I ever sharpened a pencil. When my turn came, I studied until my eyes ached and my hands cramped. I walked out of that exam exhausted and terrified. When the scores came back, I had done significantly better than him. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it was treated like an inconvenience, an anomaly that didn't fit the story they preferred to tell. That pattern followed me everywhere. In school, I had higher grades, stronger test scores, more extracurriculars. I stayed late to help teachers clean classrooms. I helped my parents with chores without being asked. I learned early that praise was scarce, so I stopped expecting it. My brother spent his time playing video games, talking back to my parents, treating them with a cruelty that I never would have dared. And yet, somehow, he was still the fragile one. The one who needed protection. The one whose potential was always just around the corner, if only the world would stop being so unfair to him. When college applications came around, the difference in how we were treated became impossible to ignore. My brother applied to one single school, a private college on the other side of the country that cost $60,000 a year. No backup options. No scholarships. No concern for cost. My dad told us he would pay for both of our educations, so my brother chose the most expensive option without hesitation. My dad paid for his tuition, his rent, his groceries, and his daily DoorDash orders. Every meal delivered. Every expense covered. My brother repaid him by failing classes, landing on academic probation, and dragging himself through with a GPA so low it barely counted as surviving. He still didn't graduate on time because he couldn't meet an internship requirement. Years later, he still hasn't finished. I watched all of this from the sidelines, absorbing the lesson without ever being taught it out loud. I worked relentlessly in high school. I tutored other students after class to afford clothes and small comforts. My parents made around $250,000 a year, but they were frugal to the point of rigidity. I learned not to ask. I learned to make do. I got nearly straight A's and applied to multiple colleges. I even got into an Ivy League school, a moment that felt surreal and fragile, like it might vanish if I spoke too loudly about it. But I didn't go. I chose the cheapest option instead, a school that still cost $60,000 a year, but where I had earned over $40,000 a year in scholarships and government loans. 3 years after my brother started college, after my dad had already paid 3.5 years of his education out of inheritance and savings, I was told the rules were different for me. My dad sat me down and explained that he could only pay for my first 2 years. There was no drama in his voice. No apology that lasted longer than a sentence. Just a statement of fact. I nodded and said I understood. I even told myself it was fair. I told myself I should be grateful. 2 years was more than most people got. I repeated that to myself like a mantra whenever the resentment threatened to surface. But numbers don't lie, even when people do. By the time my brother's education limped to a halt, my dad had paid roughly $220,000 for him. For me, he paid $60,000. I would graduate with nearly $100,000 in debt. My brother walked away with $30,000. I was an honors student in a hard science, juggling 2 jobs while carrying a full course load. My brother never worked a single job during college. Not during the year. Not during the summer. He never worried about rent or groceries or whether he could afford to eat that week. I did. There were months when I counted every dollar, when I stood in grocery store aisles doing mental math, choosing between protein and produce. There were weeks when I lived on instant noodles and peanut butter. When I told my dad I had less than $100 left for the month and couldn't afford food, he usually said tough luck. Sometimes he sent a couple $100, but not without reminding me how much he hated feeling like a bank. I learned to stop asking. I learned that my hunger was less uncomfortable to him than the idea of being inconvenienced. My parents wanted me to love my brother anyway. They wanted harmony without justice. My dad told me outright that it was never supposed to be equal or fair. I swallowed that too. I rarely complained. I never confronted them directly. I turned my anger inward and let it pool there, deep and quiet. I told myself that blaming my dad was wrong, that he was just doing his best. But the older I got, the harder that lie became to maintain. Intentions don't erase outcomes. Love doesn't excuse neglect. Then, recently, my dad did something unexpected. He offered to help pay for the rest of my education by liquidating part of his retirement or refinancing the mortgage on our family home. He said he felt guilty that my brother had gotten more. He also made it very clear that he didn't want to do it. He framed it as my decision, my responsibility. If his future was compromised, it would be because I asked for help. When I tried to ask questions to understand what this would actually mean for him, he avoided them. He shut down. He made the offer and then disappeared behind vagueness, leaving me to sit alone with the weight of it. That was the moment something in me finally cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically. It was the quiet realization that no matter what choice I made, I would be punished for it. If I accepted the help, I would be the selfish daughter who risked her father's future. If I declined, I would be the martyr who proved, once again, that I could survive on less. Either way, the imbalance remained. Either way, my brother's comfort had already been purchased at the cost of my security. I started asking myself questions I had avoided for years. Why was I expected to be endlessly understanding while my brother was endlessly accommodated? Why was my responsibility to manage everyone else's emotions greater than anyone's responsibility to treat me fairly? Why did gratitude always seem to flow in one direction? I realized that my silence had not been mistaken for strength. It had been mistaken for consent. The truth was devastating and freeing at the same time. There was no perfect argument I could make that would suddenly make my parents see me differently. There was no magical confrontation that would rewrite the past. The inequality wasn't accidental. It was a pattern, reinforced by every choice they made and every excuse they offered. And I had been carrying the emotional cost of that pattern alone. I stopped asking how to make them change and started asking a different question. What would it look like to stop waiting for fairness from people who had shown me, repeatedly, that it was not something they intended to offer? What would it mean to build a future that didn't depend on their approval or their guilt or their conditional generosity? I don't have a clean ending where everything resolves overnight. Real life doesn't work that way. But I do have clarity. I am not weak because I struggled. I am not ungrateful because I notice injustice. I am not selfish for wanting a baseline of support that was freely given to someone else. And I am not obligated to keep setting myself on fire to keep a family warm that refuses to acknowledge the heat. If there is one thing I have learned, it is this. Love without accountability becomes entitlement. Silence without boundaries becomes erasure. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stop asking people to choose you when they have already shown you who they are willing to sacrifice. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever been the responsible one who paid the price for someone else's comfort, I see you. Let me know where you're listening from, and if this story resonated with you, consider subscribing and supporting the channel. Stories like this deserve to be told, not because they are dramatic, but because they are real. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was realizing that my entire role in the family had been decided long before I was old enough to object. I wasn't the child they worried about. I was the child they relied on. And there is a quiet cruelty in being raised as the reliable one, because reliability is rarely rewarded. It is simply expected. The moment you falter, the disappointment is sharper, because you were never allowed to be human in the first place. Once I started seeing it, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction replayed itself in my mind with new clarity. When my brother failed a class, it was stress. When he missed deadlines, it was burnout. When he treated my parents with contempt, it was frustration. But when I struggled, it was mismanagement. When I was exhausted, it was poor planning. When I asked for help, it was entitlement. The rules were different because my pain was inconvenient and his was familiar. I began to understand that my parents didn't just favor my brother. They depended on me staying small, because as long as I stayed quiet and capable, they never had to face the reality of their choices. My success was useful only when it didn't demand anything back. The moment it required fairness, it became a problem. The offer my dad made about liquidating his retirement haunted me for weeks. I lay awake at night doing the math, calculating interest rates, imagining worst-case scenarios where his future collapsed and the blame quietly settled on my shoulders. I knew exactly how that story would be told. Not out loud, maybe, but in tone, in size, in looks. In the subtle way resentment seeps into every conversation until it poisons even the good moments. I realized that the offer wasn't really help. It was a test, a way to see if I would continue sacrificing myself to preserve the illusion that everything was fine. I started pulling back in small ways. I stopped volunteering details about my life. I stopped cushioning my words to protect everyone else's feelings. When my dad complained about money after sending my brother another check, I didn't rush to reassure him. I let the silence sit. It was uncomfortable, but it was honest. That was when the pushback started. Not openly, not directly. It came disguised as concern. My mother asked if I was stressed. My dad asked if school was overwhelming me. They wanted to know why I seemed distant, why I wasn't as warm, as accommodating as before. They noticed the change not because they missed me, but because the emotional labor I had always provided was suddenly absent. One night, during a phone call that was supposed to be casual, my dad finally said it out loud. He told me I had changed. He said I seemed resentful. He asked why I couldn't just let go of the past. I listened quietly, my heart pounding, because I finally understood what he was really asking. He wasn't asking for peace. He was asking for silence. That was the moment I told him the truth. Not all of it, just enough. I told him I was tired of pretending that the difference in how we were treated didn't matter. I told him I was tired of being told that fairness was never the goal. I told him that I loved my brother, but that love didn't erase the damage of watching him be rescued over and over while I learned how to drown quietly. There was a long pause. Then my dad said something I will never forget. He told me that my brother needed more help because he was weaker. And in that sentence, everything snapped into focus. My strength hadn't protected me. It had disqualified me. After that conversation, something inside me hardened in a way that felt permanent. I stopped hoping they would understand. I stopped trying to translate my pain into something more palatable. I began planning my life as if their support could vanish at any moment because emotionally it already had. I took on more hours at work. I applied for additional grants. I met with financial aid advisors and learned how to stretch every dollar until it screamed. I learned how to live with constant background anxiety, the kind that never fully leaves your body. But I also learned something else. I learned that I was surviving despite them, not because of them. The anger I had buried for years didn't explode. It settled. It became quiet and heavy and useful. It stopped being about revenge or confrontation and turned into clarity. I didn't want to punish anyone. I wanted out of the role, out of the comparison, out of the dynamic that demanded I shrink so others could feel comfortable. I stopped arguing about money entirely. When my dad complained that I didn't ask for help anymore, I told him the truth. I said I had learned not to rely on it. That answer seemed to hurt him more than any accusation ever could, because it forced him to see the outcome of his choices without me spelling it out. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with my family. Maybe distance will soften things. Maybe it won't. What I do know is that I can no longer live in a constant state of quiet self-erasure just to preserve family harmony. Harmony that only exists when one person absorbs all the damage is not harmony. It's control. I am still finishing my degree. I am still working too much. I am still tired. But for the first time, my exhaustion feels honest. It belongs to me, not to expectations that were never fair to begin with. I am building a life that doesn't require permission or guilt or comparison. And if there is one thing I wish someone had told me sooner, it's this. Being the strong one does not mean you owe everyone else your strength. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to ask for more. And you are allowed to walk away from systems that only function when you suffer quietly. If you've ever been the child who was expected to cope while someone else was constantly rescued, you are not imagining it. And you are not wrong for wanting better. Thank you for staying with my story. If this resonated with you, let me know where you're listening from. And if you want to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing. Some truths take time to tell, but they deserve to be heard all the way to the end.